Nora Vance arrived at the edge of the territory, with less than she'd left with and more silence than she knew how to carry. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it. The kind that settles into your bones after the noise of a previous life has been stripped away. She had come west, not to find fortune, but to find a place where the past might have a harder time tracking her down. She had been a married woman for 7 years, and a widow for less than one. Her husband, Thomas, had died beneath collapsed timber in a copper mine 2 counties east. The foreman had called it an accident, and the company had sent a letter with $40 folded inside, as if that could balance the scales of a life lost. But the grief wasn't the only thing that drove her here. By the time Thomas was in the ground, his family had decided that Nora carried bad fortune in her blood. No one said it outright. People rarely do, but the glances lingered too long, and the invitations simply stopped coming in their eyes. A widow without children was a woman without an anchor. So, Nora did what women have had to do for generations. When the world tells them they no longer fit, she packed her belongings into 2 crates, sold what remained, and followed a landbroker west. He was a man who spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who never planned to stay long enough to face the consequences of his promises. "This place is clean," he had told her, tapping a finger against the folded deed. "No liens. No disputes. Folks around here are moving on. That's all." Nora wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. The land cost her nearly everything. She had left $420 for a house and 40 acres that rolled out behind it toward a low ridge. And the house, well, it was a modest place. Just 1 story. It sat a mile and a half beyond the last proper fence line, where the dirt road narrowed into 2 ruts, pressed into the hard earth by wagons that no longer passed that way. The pine boards were weathered silver by the sun and wind, and the stone chimney leaned just enough to make a careful person uneasy. The land around it wasn't beautiful in the way towns advertised themselves on postcards. It was spare, broken by scrub, oak, and pale grass that bent low under the weight of winter. But it was quiet, and quiet, Nora believed, might finally help her. For those first few weeks, she told herself she was building a sanctuary. She rose before sunrise, fed the chickens she'd bought from a neighbor down the road, and hauled water from the well until her arms burned. She scrubbed the floors and patched the roof where the snow had worked its way in. She even planted a narrow winter garden behind the house, stubbornly pressing seeds into the cold soil, as if daring it to give something back. But the solitude she had paid for felt heavy. At night, the wind carried strange sounds across the land. Not voices, exactly. More like movement. Sometimes, the sound of hooves. The unease started with the small things. Once, she found one of her fence posts pulled loose and laid flat on the ground, the rope cut clean through. She fixed it herself and didn't mention it when she rode into town for supplies. But in town, the silence was different. It was the polite silence of strangers who don't intend to know you for long. When she entered the mercantile, conversation seemed to stop. The postmaster hesitated when she gave her address, his pen pausing just a second too long over the paper. "You live out past Willow Draw?" he asked. When Nora said yes, he simply nodded once. Slowly. Cold country was all he offered. By early winter, the feeling of being watched followed her home. Nora noticed the markers at the edge of her land didn't stay where she placed them. Stones shifted, Wooden stakes vanished. She told herself it was animals, or perhaps careless riders passing through. Because the alternative that someone else believed they belonged there felt too heavy to hold. The truth was, Nora already felt like a trespasser in her own home. The house creaked at night the way old houses do, but sometimes the sounds felt deliberate. A floorboard would groan in a room she hadn't entered all day. Once, the back door latch rattled, as if tested by a hand that knew its weight. She began to sleep with a broom beside the bed. Not because she truly thought a broom would stop anything, but because holding anything made the dark easier to face. Nora had lived long enough among men to know that when silence wasn't peace, it was a warning. Still, she stayed. She stayed because leaving would mean admitting she had been fooled again. She stayed because, unsettled as it felt, this land did not look at her with pity. She stayed because the grief she carried followed her, no matter how far she went. And at least here, amidst the silver pine and the cold wind, it had room to breathe. She didn't know it then, but the silence was about to break. The change in the weather didn't come as a whisper. It came as a judgment. On the afternoon, the storm finally broke. The sky dropped low and gray, pressing against the hills as if it meant to crush them flat. The snow began to fall thick and fast, driven sideways by a wind sharp enough to cut through wool. It was the kind of cold that seeks out the gaps in the walls, the kind that reminds you how thin the barrier is between a warm hearth and the uncaring wild. Nora secured the shutters and stoked the stove until the iron glowed a dull, angry red. By nightfall, the world beyond her windows had simply disappeared. The familiar ridge, the fence line, the scrub oak, all of it was erased by a wall of white. She was alone, barricaded inside a house that suddenly felt very small against the vastness of the storm. That was when she heard the knocking. It wasn't polite. It wasn't the cautious tap of a traveler looking for directions. It was 3 hard blows, heavy enough to shake the door in its frame. Nora froze, her breath catching somewhere between fear and disbelief. No one came this way in weather like this. No one sane. Anyway, she stood in the center of the kitchen, the silence of the house suddenly screaming in her ears. She grabbed the broom from the corner, a ridiculous weapon. She knew, but holding it made her hands stop shaking. "Go away," she called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the roaring wind outside. "There's no one out here." A pause followed, heavy and suffocating. Then, a voice pushed through the thick wood of the door, rough, slurred, and edged with pain. "Wife," the man said. "Open the door." Nora stepped back, her heart pounding hard enough to bruise her ribs. Wife. The word hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. She had been a widow for 7 years. Whoever stood on her porch was lost, drunk, or dangerous, or perhaps all three. "I said go away," she shouted, forcing steadiness into her tone. "There's nothing here for you." The answer was a violent impact. Something struck the door again, not a fist this time, but the heavy thud of a body thrown against the wood. The latch rattled. Metal, screeching against metal. Nora stumbled backward, raising the broom like a pike. Just as the door burst inward, snow and freezing air poured into the room, the lamp flickering wildly as the wind rushed past her skirts. And there, staggering across the threshold, was the storm-given human shape. He was a tall man, well over 6 feet. His broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of exhaustion and drink. He dragged the winter in with him. His coat hung open, stiff with ice, and darkened at one sleeve, where fresh blood had soaked through the fabric. Snow clung to his hair, which fell loose and black around a face that was battered and bruised. He nearly collapsed, catching himself on the doorframe with a muttered curse in a language Nora didn't recognize. "Get out," she screamed, swinging the broom up between them. "Get out of my house." The man lifted his head slowly. One eye was swollen nearly shut, and a deep cut split his cheek. But the eye that could open, it rooted her in place. It was dark, unsteady, and burning with something that felt far older than anger. "There you are," he murmured, as if speaking to a ghost. "I knew you'd be here." He stepped further inside, kicking the door shut behind him with a hollow, final sound that echoed in Nora's bones. She backed away until her shoulders hit the far wall. "I'll scream," she warned. "I'll scream until someone comes." The man, this intruder named Elias, didn't seem to hear the threat. He glanced around the room, his gaze slow and deliberate. He looked at the stove, the table, the lamp by the window. It wasn't the look of a thief casing a house. It was the look of a man trying to reconcile a memory with reality. "No one's coming," he said, his voice thick. "Storm like this." "You know that. You're drunk," Nora said, her voice trembling. "You don't know where you are." His mouth twisted into a bitter shape. "I know exactly where I am." And then he did something that terrified her more than the violence had. He walked past her. He didn't lunge. He didn't attack. He walked past her as if she were nothing more than misplaced furniture. Nora rushed after him, striking his arm with the broom handle. He hissed sharply, his hand flying to his wounded sleeve. But he didn't strike back. He just stopped at the doorway to the bedroom. "Our room," he said softly. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. That's not funny, but he wasn't laughing. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The lamp cast a soft glow over the narrow bed. The quilt she had stitched herself neatly folded at the foot. Elias crossed the room without hesitation. Every step was certain. He moved around the chest at the foot of the bed without looking down, guided by muscle memory instead of sight. Nora stood frozen in the doorway as he sat on the edge of the bed, then lowered himself fully onto it with a rough groan. The fight seemed to drain out of him the moment his head touched the pillow. "This is my house," he whispered, his eyes closing. "You're standing on my land. That's impossible." Nora shot back, though her voice was brittle. "I bought this place. I have the deed." He didn't open his eyes. "They sold what wasn't theirs," he murmured. Nora wanted to argue. She wanted to shout, to demand answers, to shake him awake and force him back into the storm. But before she could speak, his shoulders sagged, his breathing slowed, uneven but deep. Within seconds, the intruder was asleep, just like that. The violence drained from the room, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Nora stood there, stunned, the broom hanging uselessly at her side. The man lay sprawled across her bed, boots still on, chest rising and falling, with the heavy rhythm of someone who had gone too long without rest. She didn't touch him. She didn't try to drag him out. Instead, she dragged a hard-backed chair into the corner of the room and sat down, pulling the broom across her knees like a guard, posted at some forgotten frontier. Her eyes never left him. All night, she watched. She watched his face twitch in troubled dreams. She heard him murmur words, She couldn't understand prayers and curses tangled together. Once, he reached out blindly, his fingers curling against the empty air as if searching for someone long gone. "Wife," he whispered again. Barely a sound at all. Nora's arms ached. Her eyes burned. But sleep never came. As the hours stretched on, her fear began to curdle into something heavier, an awful, sinking certainty. The broker's smooth confidence, the postmaster's hesitation, the fence posts that moved in the night. It all fell into place, like the tumblers of a lock, turning. This land had never been empty, and whatever claim she thought she had, whatever paper she held in her safe box, it was nothing compared to the claim of the man breathing quietly in her bed, waiting to wake. Morning came to the high country, not with warmth, but with a thinning of the dark. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving the world locked beneath a hard, white stillness. Inside the house, the light that crept through the frost-laced windows was pale and colorless, revealing the wreckage of the night before in unforgiving detail. Nora Vance woke with a sharp ache in her neck, and the bitter taste of fear still clinging to the back of her tongue. For a moment, disoriented by the cold and the silence, she didn't know where she was. Then she felt the weight of the broom across her lap, the hard bite of the wooden chair into her spine. And then, she heard him breathe. The intruder, the man who had claimed her home as his own, lay exactly where he had fallen. He was sprawled across her quilt, boots still on, one arm flung over his chest as if guarding something unseen. In the light of day, the threat of him was replaced by the brutal reality of his condition. His injuries looked far worse than they had in the flickering shadows of the storm. Deep bruises flowered along his ribs in shades of angry purple and sickly yellow. His knuckles were split and swollen. The raw skin cracked open from impact. Dried blood traced a dark line down his temple. Tangling in his black hair like a crown of thorns, he stirred, frowning as though the waking world itself had offended him. He opened his eyes, slowly, for a heartbeat, and stared at the ceiling. He didn't move. His gaze drifted across the room, taking in the dresser Nora had hauled in herself. The patched curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks. The unfamiliar lamp on the nightstand. Confusion crept over his face, followed by something sharper, something like shame. Then, he saw her. Nora shot to her feet so fast the chair scraped loudly across the floorboards. She raised the broom again, instinct taking over before reason could catch up. "Don't move," she commanded. The man winced not at the threat of the broom, but at the sound of her voice. He pushed himself upright, his breath hissing through clenched teeth, as his bruised ribs protested the movement. "Looks like I already did," he muttered, his voice rough with thirst. "You broke into my house," Nora said, her voice trembling but holding its ground. "You frightened me half to death." He dragged a hand down his face, stopping when his fingers brushed the cut on his cheek. He stared at the blood on his skin, as if surprised to find it there. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said quietly. And strangely, Nora believed him. "I didn't even mean to drink that much." "That's supposed to help," she snapped. He glanced at the broom, then back at her eyes. "You can put that down. If I wanted to hurt you, I wouldn't have waited for morning." Nora hesitated. She lowered the broom an inch, but kept her grip tight. "Who are you?" "Elias," he said. After a moment, "Elias Chato." The name settled into the room, heavy and unfamiliar. Elias gestured weakly around him. "This house. Used to be mine. Nora shook her head. That's not possible. I bought it. I paid for it. I have the papers. So did they. Elias replied. Didn't make it right. He spoke without drama. His voice tired. He explained it to her then, while the cold morning light illuminated the distance between them. The land had belonged to his family, passed down through Apache law, memory, and blood, not through deeds stamped in ink. After his wife died, buried on the ridge behind the house, he couldn't breathe here anymore. He had left to outrun the grief, and while he was gone, men came with documents and smiles, and sold what they had no right to sell. Nora felt the room tilt. The smooth-talking broker, the hesitation of the postmaster, the shifting fence posts. So I was lied to, she said softly. Elias nodded. You weren't the first. And the sheriff, she asked. The law. A bitter curve touched his mouth. The law listens to paper. Silence pressed in, thick and unavoidable. Nora looked at this battered man, this stranger, who carried a grief that mirrored her own. If this goes to court, she said slowly, they'll throw you off. Or worse. They've tried before. Elias said. That's why I don't stay in town long. Nora studied his hands, the split knuckles, the tremors. Is that why you were drunk? He exhaled through his nose. A humorless sound. That's part of it. The rest. Elias looked away, his jaw tightening. I went to the saloon last night. Didn't plan to drink much. Just wanted to sit somewhere warm, where no one knew me. That didn't work. Nora guessed. No. His voice dropped. A man recognized me. Started talking about the land. About how it was finally cleaned up. Nora's stomach tightened. I told him to stop. Elias went on. He didn't. He said things about my wife. About how she was better off dead than buried on stolen ground. His hands curled slowly into fists on the quilt. I don't remember throwing the first punch, but I remember the last one. Nora swallowed. She could see it. The blood on sawdust. A room full of men pretending not to see. The explosion of violence born from a broken heart. You walked all the way out here like that, she asked. Elias shrugged and immediately winced. Didn't have much choice. The snow started falling before I left town. I was halfway here before I realized how bad I was bleeding. And you came here, she said. He nodded. This place has a way of pulling me back, even when I don't want it to. Nora let out a slow breath. She thought of the money she had lost. She thought of the silence she had carried here. She thought of the paper men who would come for him. And, eventually, for her, if he stayed, he would be arrested. If she was forced to leave, she would be destitute. The legal system was a trap. But it was also a maze. And Nora Vance had learned a few things about navigating mazes. There's a way, she said finally. Elias raised an eyebrow, the swelling distorting the gesture. I'm listening. She told him what she knew of the law, just enough to understand where it tangled itself into knots. Evictions were simple when it was a squatter against an owner. But marriage complicated things. Specifically, marriage between a white woman and an Apache man. Officials preferred not to untangle those knots quickly. Claims froze. Time stretched. Elias stared at her, the fog in his eyes clearing. You'd marry me, on paper, she said sharply. Don't flatter yourself. He let out a short, incredulous laugh. You're braver than you look. I'm tired of being fooled, she replied. If we're going to fight this, we fight together. They moved to the kitchen. There was no ceremony, no romance. They wrote it out on a piece of scrap paper at the rough-hewn table, their hands stiff from the cold. It was a simple agreement, a partnership. If the land was secured, it would be divided evenly. No promises beyond survival. Elias signed first Elias Chato. Nora followed Nora Vance. Her hand was steady. Despite the pounding of her heart, they shook hands. And only then, as he pulled away, did Nora notice him swaying. "You should sit," she said. He waved her off, trying to stand tall, then nearly collapsed. Nora lunged forward, catching his arm before he hit the floor. The contact sent a strange jolt through her warmth. Tension. An awareness she didn't have words for yet. He was heavy, solid, and very much alive. "Sit," she ordered. This time, he obeyed. Nora fetched water from the stove, heated just enough to steam, and a tin of salve from her supplies. She knelt in front of him, the hem of her dress settling in the dust, and rolled up his sleeve. The cut was deep, angry, and caked with dried blood. Elias watched her quietly. His breathing was shallow, his eyes dark with pain. "This might sting," she warned. "I earned it," he murmured. She dipped the cloth and pressed it to the wound. Elias sucked in a sharp breath. His hand flew out, closing reflexively around her wrist. Not hard, but firm. Instinctive. Nora froze. Her pulse hammered against his palm. For a second, the air in the kitchen grew thin. Elias realized what he had done. He released her instantly, pulling his hand back as if he had been burned. "Sorry," he muttered. "It's all right," Nora said, though her voice betrayed her. "Just don't do that again." She went back to work. She cleaned the grit from his skin, applied the salve, and bound the arm with clean linen. Her fingers were careful, almost reverent. Beneath her touch, she felt the history of the man, the scars, the muscle, the heat. He was a man who had carried grief and anger far longer than he admitted. When she stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, Elias looked up at her. The suspicion was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet, guarded gratitude. "Thank you," he said. Nora nodded, unsure what to do with the tightness in her chest. Outside, the sun climbed higher, glinting off the untouched snow. The land waited, and inside the house, with a scrap of paper lying on the table between them, Nora and Elias waited too. The storm had passed, but the real struggle had only just begun. The paper they had signed lay folded in Nora's apron pocket, kept warm by the heat of her own body. It was a strange thing, a marriage that existed only because the world outside the house made it necessary. It was a shield made of ink and cheap paper, designed to keep the wolves at bay. But inside the house, where the wind couldn't reach, the pretending began to take on a life of its own. At first, they moved around each other like cautious animals sharing the same shelter. There was a careful choreography to their days. Nora rose early, as she always had, keeping to her chores, measuring her steps so they would not brush against his. She claimed the kitchen, he claimed the yard. They were two solitary creatures who had forgotten the language of us. Elias slept late during those first few weeks, his body still mending from the fight and the freeze. When he did wake, his movements were stiff and guarded. They spoke little, but not out of hostility. It was a shared understanding that words, once spoken, could not be taken back. But as winter began to loosen its grip on the valley, something shifted. The silence, which had once felt like a warning, began to soften. When people from town came by, first the sheriff, then a land agent sniffing around with false politeness, Elias didn't hide. He stood close to Nora, his hands settled lightly at the small of her back. Steady and familiar, in a way that surprised them both. Nora learned to lean into that touch without flinching. She learned the weight of him beside her, the subtle shift of his stance when he sensed trouble before it spoke aloud. "Mrs. Chato," the sheriff had said, testing the sound of it, and Nora had answered without hesitation, "Yes, sir." That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to Elias breathe from the other side of the wall, and wondered when the lie had begun to feel so natural. As the days lengthened, the work of living took over. Nora insisted on planting the garden again, though the soil was stubborn and half-frozen. Elias helped without being asked. He hauled water from the well until his bandages were soaked with sweat. He fixed the sagging fence along the back edge of the land, driving the posts deep into the ground with a rhythmic, steady force. They worked side by side, roots sinking into the thawing earth, building a perimeter against the world. And then, the thaw finally broke. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky that was painfully blue. Elias was struggling with an old iron pipe near the trough that refused to seal. He was wrestling with the rusted metal, muttering under his breath, when the water burst loose without warning. A sharp, icy spray shot sideways, soaking Nora from waist to hem. She yelped, stumbling back, her heavy skirts clinging to her legs. Cold and shocking. "Elias," she shouted. He looked up, startled, water dripping from his chin. And then, he laughed. It wasn't a guarded smile. It wasn't a polite exhale. It was a full, open laugh that seemed to catch him by surprise as much as it did her. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten he was allowed to be light. "Oh, that's funny to you," Nora said, narrowing her eyes. Before he could react, she grabbed the hose. She swung it toward him, and the water splashed across his chest, darkening his shirt instantly. He cursed, laughing, and lunged for the pipe, missing as the spray caught him square in the face. "Careful," he warned, grinning through the water. "Now you'll regret that." "I already regret trusting you with tools," she shot back. They chased each other across the yard like children who had forgotten their own age, forgotten the grief that lived in the marrow of their bones. Nora slipped once in the mud, her boots losing traction, and Elias caught her around the waist, steadying her for a breath. Neither of them moved. Water dripped from her hair. His hands were firm, warm through the thin fabric of her dress. She laughed first, breathless and flushed. "Let go," she said, "before I change my mind and hit you with this again." He released her slowly, his smile softer now, something thoughtful behind it. That evening, the house felt different. They sat near the stove. Their damp clothes hung to dry on the backs of chairs, the air smelling of wood smoke and wool. They shared a simple meal, passing the bread and the salt. Nora realized she hadn't laughed like that since before Thomas died. The thought startled her that joy could return, unannounced, in the middle of a muddy yard. But she did not push it away. Nights grew quieter, but it was a companionable quiet. They talked more now, not about the land or the law, but about small things, stories from childhood, half-remembered songs. The way the light hit the ridge at sunset. Nora learned that Elias slept lightly, waking at the slightest sound. Elias learned that Nora sometimes talked in her sleep, murmuring apologies to people who were no longer there. One night, the wind rattled the windows hard enough to wake her. She sat up, her heart racing, the old fear of the empty house rising in her throat. But the house wasn't empty. Before she could think better of it, she crossed the hall and knocked on Elias's door. "It's just the wind," he said gently. He was already awake. "I know," she replied, wrapping her shawl tighter. He opened the door wider. "Come sit. You don't have to explain," he added. They sat on the edge of his bed, close enough that their shoulders touched. Nora could feel the heat of him through her sleeve. Steady and grounding. The darkness of the room didn't feel menacing anymore. It felt private. Without looking at her, Elias spoke into the dark. "I don't dream much anymore," he said quietly. "But when I do, I don't like being alone afterward." Nora understood that. She understood it more than she wanted to admit. Grief leaves a hollow space that echoes loudest in the dark. The first time they crossed the line, it wasn't planned. It wasn't dramatic. It was late. The house was warm, and the fire was burning low in the grate. Nora stood to leave the room, to retreat to her side of the house, and Elias caught her hand. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't rough. It was just enough pressure to ask the question he could not bring himself to voice. Nora looked at him. She saw the bruises fading on his face, but she also saw the scars that went deeper. She saw a man who was terrified of losing anything else. Reaching out anyway, she did not pull away. They kissed slowly, cautiously, as if learning the shape of something fragile. Nora felt the tension in him, the immense restraint he was holding back. When she rested her forehead against his, he whispered, "We don't have to." "I know," she said, "but I want to." Their first night together was quiet, deliberate. There was no rush, no hunger that burned too fast. It was just hands exploring carefully, bodies listening to one another. Nora felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with need and everything to do with recognition. Elias held her as though she might disappear if he let go. In the morning, the light spilled soft and gold across the floorboards. Nora woke with Elias's arm around her waist, his breath warm against her shoulder. For one fleeting, beautiful moment. There was no past. There was no threat of eviction. There were no papermen coming to take the land. There was only the weight of another human being beside her. Then, she remembered the paper in her pocket. She lay still, staring at the sun-bleached wall, wondering when pretending had become something else entirely. And more importantly, she wondered if either of them knew how to stop. Because out on the ridge, the snow was melting, and the world was waking up. And with the waking world came the memory of who they were before they were us. The thaw had brought them together. But Nora knew that spring often reveals what the snow has kept hidden. And not all of it is beautiful. The trouble did not come all at once. It crept in slowly, the way doubt always does, quiet, patient, and certain it would be noticed eventually. Nora began to see it in the small things. She saw it in the way Elias would stop at the threshold of a room, his hand resting against the frame as if he had forgotten why he entered. She saw it in the way he stood in the yard at dusk, staring toward the low ridge behind the house, where the land rose and fell like a long-held breath. When she called his name, he would startle, then smile too quickly, as though trying to convince her or perhaps himself that he was truly there. At night, After they lay together, he sometimes turned away. It wasn't cold, and it certainly wasn't unkind, but it was distant in a way Nora recognized too well. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself that a man who had lost everything needed time to learn how to hold something new. Then came the afternoon. Elias went into town to speak with a clerk about the land records. Nora was alone in the house, looking for a spool of twine in the storage chest beneath the bed. She didn't find the twine. Instead, she found a small bundle wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside lay a beaded necklace, the work fine and deliberate, the colors like old sand and dried clay. Beside it was a folded scrap of leather with a name pressed into it, worn smooth by the friction of a thumb, rubbing over it again and again. Nora didn't need to ask whose it was. She sat on the floor, the necklace heavy in her palm, and felt the air leave the room. She didn't mention it when Elias returned. She just watched him. She watched the way his eyes softened when the fire burned low, and how his voice changed when he spoke of the land reverent, as if speaking to a memory she couldn't see. That night, the dam broke. Nora woke in the dark to the sound of Elias's breath hitching. His hand tightened around her waist, a grip of desperation. Then he spoke soft, broken words not meant for her ears. He called out a name, and the name was not Nora. She lay there long after his breathing steadied, staring into the dark, her chest tight with a familiar, hollow ache. It was the same feeling she had known after her first husband died, when she realized the world had no room for her grief. But this was different. This was the realization that she had fallen in love with a man whose heart was a haunted house. By morning, the decision had already taken shape in her mind. They ate breakfast in silence. Elias noticed the change. He noticed everything, but he didn't press. When Nora finished her coffee, she stood up. "We need to talk," she said. He nodded, setting his cup down. "All right. I found her things," she said. She didn't soften the blow. Under the bed, Elias's face went still, a mask dropping into place. "I should have told you." "Yes," Nora replied. "You should have." The words that followed came sharper than she intended. She spoke of the necklace, of the name he whispered in his sleep, of the way he seemed to vanish into memories she couldn't touch. "I understand grief, Elias," she said, her voice trembling. "I understand holding on, but I won't be a substitute. I won't live in someone else's shadow." He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. That silence broke something in her. "So that's it," she demanded. "You don't even deny it." "I don't know how," he said quietly. Nora let out a thin, brittle laugh. "That's honest. At least." She told him then that she would leave. Once the land matter was settled, once he was safe, the agreement would end. She would not pretend on paper or in bed any longer. "You think I don't see it?" she asked, the hurt finally bleeding into her voice. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be chosen second?" Elias's hands curled at his sides. "I never chose you second. You never chose me first," she shot back. That stopped him. He looked at her, then really looked at her, and for the first time, Nora saw fear. Not the fear of the law or the men in town, but something raw and unguarded. "If I chose you," he said, his voice rough, "they'd take everything from you." "I won't do that. I didn't ask you to protect me," Nora said. "I asked you to be honest." He ran a hand over his face, a gesture so tired and familiar, it made her heart ache, despite her anger. He stepped closer, stopping just short of touching her. "You think I keep her things because I'm waiting to go back," he said. "I keep them because if I let them go, I'm afraid I'll forget who I was before the world decided I didn't belong." He looked her in the eye, the truth settling between them, heavy and unavoidable. "I don't cling to you because of the past, Nora. I hold back because of it." He told her then about the threats, the violence, the men who had taken pieces of his life one demand at a time. He told her he was afraid that loving her openly would mark her. It would turn her into a target. It would make her another thing he had failed to protect. "I'd rather lose you by choice," he said, his voice cracking, "than watch you lose everything because of me." Nora stared at him, her breath trembling, the anger drained away, replaced by the staggering weight of his confession. He wasn't pushing her away because he didn't love her. He was pushing her away because he did. "You don't get to decide that alone," she whispered. But before they could bridge the distance, before they could decide if staying was worth the cost, the world outside made the decision for them. The men came at dawn, as they always did when they meant to be taken seriously. Nora saw them first from the kitchen window. 3 riders moving slow and deliberate along the fence line, their horses cutting dark shapes against the pale ground. One wore a city coat, too fine for the dust. Another carried a leather satchel that bounced against his thigh with every step. Paper men, Nora thought. The most dangerous kind. Elias stood beside her. He was already awake, already still. He watched the riders approach with the resignation of a man who had seen this ending written long ago. "They won't stop this time," he said. Nora set the coffee pot down. Her hands did not shake. She had lived too long in fear to let it have her now. The riders dismounted at the gate. The man with the satchel stepped forward, his boots clean, his voice practiced. "Samuel Yazzie," he called out, using Elias's old name. "We're here to resolve the matter of unlawful occupation." Elias moved to the door, his shoulders set. He intended to go out there. He intended to surrender the house, to give up the fight, just to keep the trouble away from Nora. But Nora moved faster. She stepped onto the porch, the cold morning air biting through her sleeves, and placed herself squarely between the men and the door. "I'm Mrs. Chato," she said, "and this is my home." The man glanced down at his papers, unimpressed. "Ma'am, this land has been sold twice over in the last 5 years. Your arrangement doesn't alter that." "It does," Nora replied evenly. She reached into her apron pocket. She had not told Elias what she meant to do, not because she wanted to surprise him, but because she knew he would try to stop her. He would try to save her from the stain of his name. She handed the man the folded document. It wasn't the scrap of paper they had written weeks ago at the kitchen table. It was a marriage certificate, properly witnessed, properly signed. A legal declaration she had ridden into town to file herself the day after their argument. The man frowned, scanning the page. The silence stretched tight as a bowstring. "You understand what this means?" he asked, looking up at her with new scrutiny. "Yes," Nora said. "I understand exactly." She knew what it meant. It meant whispers in the mercantile. It meant the postmaster's hesitation would turn into refusal. It meant that wherever Elias went, she would be marked, too. It meant choosing a life that could not be folded away when it became inconvenient. Elias's voice came low from the doorway behind her. "Nora." She did not turn. She kept her eyes on the agent. "I chose to stay," she said, loud enough for the world to hear. "With or without your permission." The man cleared his throat. shifting his weight. He looked at the paper, then at the house, then at the woman standing like iron on the porch. This complicates matters. That's the point, Nora said. There was a long pause. Horses shifted. The wind moved through the dry grass. Finally, the man folded the paper and slid it back into his satchel. We'll have to review, he said stiffly. Until then, no action will be taken. They rode away without another word. Nora stood there until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. Only then did she let herself breathe. Elias came to her slowly, stepping out onto the porch as if afraid the floorboards might give way. He looked at her, and his face was tight with something she had never seen there before. A mixture of awe and terrifying vulnerability. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, she said softly, turning to face him. I did. He searched her face. You know what this costs. I know what leaving costs, she replied. I've paid it before. They stood there, a long moment, the land stretching wide and quiet around them. The papermen had gone. The threat remained. Certainly it would always remain. But the weight of it had shifted. It no longer rested on his shoulders alone. For the first time since she had arrived at the edge of the territory, the silence didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a beginning. Spring arrived, not with a shout, but with a softening. The ice on the ridge gave way to the green of new grass. And the wind, once a warning, became a breath. One evening, as the light turned low and gold, Elias came inside and set a small bundle on the table. It was the beaded necklace, wrapped in cloth. He didn't look away from it this time. He looked at it with the steady gaze of a man who was done running. I'm burying it, he said quietly. Not to forget, just to let it rest. Nora nodded, understanding the difference. I'll come with you. They walked to the ridge together under a sky just beginning to show its first stars. The air was cool, smelling of damp earth and pine. Elias dug the small hole with his hands, slow and deliberate. When the earth closed over the necklace, he stayed still for a long time, his hand resting on the soil, as if saying a final, silent goodbye. I loved her, he said. I know, Nora replied. He turned to her then. The lines of pain that had defined his face that first winter night had smoothed out. And I love you, he said. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't pleading. It was just true, plain and honest. As the ground beneath their boots, Nora rested her forehead against his shoulder. Then don't protect me from your life, she whispered. Let me live it with you. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as the night settled in. They married again that summer, this time with witnesses. No fine clothes, just a few neighbors and a shared meal. The land bore witness the way it always had. Samuel Elias Chato did not become less Apache because he stayed. And Nora did not become less herself because she chose him. They built a life that belonged to neither world entirely, but to both. Years later, when the field stood tall and the house rang with laughter instead of silence, Nora would often think back to the night of the storm. She would remember the knocking, the fear, and the man who had fallen into her life, broken and lost. She would remember how close she had come to sending him back into the snow. Instead, she had opened the door, and in doing so, she had found not just a place to stand, but someone willing to stand with her on land that no longer asked who it belonged to, only who would stay. Thank you for journeying with us to Broken Creek. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to start over when you thought your story was finished? or found a home in the most unexpected of places? Let us know where you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet porch in Kentucky or a busy city apartment in Seattle, we're glad you're here. If this story touched you, please leave a like. It helps us keep the campfire burning, and share it with a friend who might need a reminder that it's never too late for a second chance. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Echoes of the West for more stories of the frontier. Until next time, keep the lantern lit